So good afternoon, everyone. This panel will be in charge of Ignasi Grau, General Director of OIDEL, a non-profit organization which aims is to promote freedom of education, and Rodrigo Melo Queiroz, Chairman of European Council of National Association of Independent School. Thanks so much for coming. We have 40 minutes of conference and then 20 minutes of questions and answer sessions. Thanks so much.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure, I think, for both of us being here and having the chance of talking on education in such a wonderful summer university in which the aim is to think about the future of our own countries and about Europe. What I'm going to try to do today, first I'm going to try to show you the main arguments against educational pluralism in order you can understand which are the constructions that the main thinkers have developed to attack freedom of education or educational pluralism. And after that, what I'm going to try to do is give you some vibes and some of the trends on why educational pluralism is important to think the future of Europe, and why educational pluralism should be one of the cornerstones of the European project. So, so about the arguments that are contrary to freedom of education or educational pluralism. When we think the arguments that are being developed against educational pluralism, we have the tendency to think, well, they are all come from Marxist authors. But what we are realizing lately is like Marxist authors or Marxist philosophers do not have a huge impact on educational debates. Actually, there are people that are criticizing the ones who are going against educational pluralism as Marxists, but the main danger we are perceiving today as people who advocate for educational pluralism, the main arguments are built under a liberal perspective that understands freedom as autonomy. And what I would like to do now is give you some more context on that so you can understand why this definition of freedom as autonomy can be dangerous for the future of educational pluralism. Before that, you are all familiar with what do I mean by educational pluralism, right? I mean, I'm talking about the right of parents of choosing the education they want for their children. And I'm also talking about the right of civil society to create their own schools and have something to say in the educational landscape. So, first, we have so many screens here. Okay, so first, to give you some context of this sort of definition of education as autonomy. I think when we think education as autonomy, one of the main thinkers to came to our mind is Stuart Mill, but I don't think he's the more enlightening author to think about that. So I think Ferdinand de Buisson, which was a French philosopher, he was a Nobel Prize, and more important on this context, he was one of the most important minds behind the French law of 1905 on the right to education. As you know, this law was a landmark for French education as it established the separation between church and state, and it bans educational congregations within the educational French landscape. And he established two important things for education: freedom and laicity. The problem is the way he understands freedom. It was not like, let's give everybody the chance to choose how do they want to raise their children. He considered that a French education, a Republican education, should enable children to be free, and Ferdinand de Buisson understand that parents were a potential hazard to the education of their kids, as they probably want to prevent their children to learn some things, and they want to force their children to know some things that could be contrary to the spirit of the Republic. And then, on terms of laicity, he was not really talking about, the problem was that he was not just talking about the separation of the state and the church. One of the problems is that he perceived civil society organizations and therefore non-governmental schools as a threat. He said, like, education gives us, these institutions gives a center, a plan, a method and a direction that could be contrary to the libre sort, the free reign, that was more proper of the Republican education. So he say, in a way, we need a state that enables children to be free, instead of giving the voice to parents and civil society organizations a voice in order to enable them to raise their kids the way they want. He was still talking about the idea of autonomy, but he had the idea of autonomy in mind. I mean, or at least like he sowed the seed in order the authors that appear in the late 20th century and in the beginning of the 21st century. So he sowed the seed in order like a group of American authors developed later this idea of liberty as freedom as autonomy that is really damaging for the idea of educational pluralism. So what is the idea behind that? This group of authors, mostly American authors, here I give you some definitions of the way they understand which should be the aim of education. They say the aim of education should be enabling children to choose who do they want to be once they are 18. And these authors say like non-governmental schools can be dangerous because, for instance, faith-based schools or schools with a cultural approach are conditioning children to follow a particular path. So he say like, if we enable parents to choose the education they want for their children, or if we enable civil society to create their own schools, children are going to follow a particular path, and therefore they are not going to be able to choose who they want to be. They are going to be forced without knowing which kind of citizens they want to be. It's true, like, these authors start thinking that, especially thinking on national debates in the US, thinking about the opposition of Jewish Orthodox or Mennonites or Amish against mainstream education, but they have developed this theory and now also has a damaging effect for the rights of parents and the rights of civil society schools in many other contexts. So what are the implications of that? Well, the first one is like, these authors say, these authors, what they say is like, it's really hard to put all the models of good life that the state can what they say is like the state cannot encourage any model of good life. So therefore, they shouldn't be encouraging Catholic schools or Protestant schools or Montessori schools. What the state should do is just create a model in which all children are forced to learn all the good models of good life in order to enable them, once they are 18, who they want to be. Now, for instance, some of the problematics on when we talk about educational pluralism is like, for instance, many people are against faith-based schools or some cultural schools with a cultural approach because they say these schools are preventing children to learn, for instance, comprehensive sexual education, or these schools are not teaching certain values that are essential for a democratic society. So what is the consequences of that? First consequence is that this narrative, what it requires is first a stronger state. It says like the main provider of education should be the state, because even though the state is not perfect, it can put together all the different good models of life together. It's true, it's not the perfect actor, but we don't have any better. And then the second thing is the shrinkage of the role of parents and non-governmental institutions. So these kind of philosophical authors, what they say is like, we cannot trust parents and we cannot trust civil society schools because, as I was saying, they will try to force children to think in a particular way. I could go later, I could develop that later, but what are the main flaws of that? And probably, if you think about that now in Spain with the new law, or if you think in national debates, many times what they are saying is that they are not saying Catholic schools are bad, or we want the state to have the control of education. They say it's a more sophisticated argument like that, like Catholic schools cannot prepare students for the 21st century citizens that we need. They say, well, these schools are forcing children to think in a particular way, therefore we should give a bigger role to the state because we are better doing that. So what are the main flaws of that? First, and Rodrigo can develop that later, there is a lack of scientific evidence about that, like non-governmental schools, and by that I include faith-based schools, the students that come out from the system, we don't have any evidence that are less autonomous or that they have less chances to choose which kind of education they want, which kind of future they want for themselves. Like actually, we have children from faith-based schools that are even against faith-based schools, or that are against their own schools, Montessori's or Waldorf-Steiner, etc. Second is that this is a non-plausible system. In a way, like, children are in school 8 hours a day, and at the end, like, they cannot be learning all the models of good life that there is in a society. And at one point, some models are going to be discriminated. Some models are not going to be part of that. So this model implies discrimination for certain models of good life. And here, also, what we could say is what Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, says, that behind neutrality, more often than not, it is hiding the hegemonic culture, which de facto, in a subtle and indirect manner, can be discriminatory. The third flaw is that there is a lack of trust towards parents and civil society, and a democracy that don't trust their citizens is not really a fully democracy. Like, a democracy have to trust their citizens, and therefore they have to trust their citizens to raise their children, or the future citizens. And finally, the last flaw is that perceive the cultural dimension as something that can be contrary to democracy, right? It says like, ooh, the fact like children can be raised in a particular cultural perspective can be bad per se by children. And democracies appear in order different people with different cultural perspectives could live together no matter what. And at the moment we start saying, well, yeah, but there are cultural perspectives, you know, that it's better that they have the ability to choose, as some could be more dangerous. It's also one of the flaws of this system, that see with suspicion some of the cultural dimensions of the educational process. Okay, now that I have talked about, and I think it's important, about this idea of freedom as autonomy, as a dangerous narrative against educational pluralism, what I would like to do is share with you why the pluralistic approach of the right to education is important in democratic societies. So what I'm going to do is as follows. I'm going to first talk you about the aim of education. I'm not going to make anything up. I'm just going to go through the international instruments. Then I'm going to talk you about the cultural approach and educational pluralism, and then I'm going to talk about which pillars or which should be the cornerstones of an educational system that bears in mind educational pluralism. So what is the aim of education? We could discuss we could be discussing about the aim of education for hours, but at the end we have the international documents, the Human Rights Declaration, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and many other documents. And what we agreed is that the aim of education is that education shall be directed. The first aim of education, then there are some others, but the first aim is education shall be directed to the full development of human personality. This is in line with what many other authors have said. For instance, Kant say, men can become men only through education. No, what it enables us to get into the adult life is education. Or Hannah Arendt also say, like, education is what enables children to get into the adult life. There is this dimension here in education, that education, a big part of education is learning who we are. Also, to give you some more perspective on this aim of education, the UNESCO in the Delors report, which is one of the most influential reports of UNESCO, says, education must contribute to the full development of each individual, a spirit, body, intelligence, sensibility, aesthetic, sense, and blah, blah, blah. Well, he tells other things. I'm not going to bore you about that. So how should we understand the full development of the human personality? At this point, many could say, well, you know, this perspective of liberty as autonomy is a fulfilling answer, you know, because basically it's giving children the chance to choose who they want to be. We teach them a little bit of everything, and then once they are 18, they just go out into the adult life as if they were in the supermarket, and they choose, you know what, I like that, and I like that, and I'm going to create my identity in this regard. Nevertheless, this gives us a partial dimension of what the human being is, because this understands the children as an isolated island, like something that goes by themselves, like an item. But the human being, and especially the children in this process, it has a part of individuality, but it also has a part of social. Also, like quoting some authors, like I like a lot the idea of Victor Hugo when he said like the human being is solitaire and solidaire, no, it's solitary and solidary. Or Mounier also say like the human being is I'm going to say that in French and now I'm going to, un dedans qui a besoin d'un dehors, no, an inside that has a need for an outside. And also, once again, we can be agree or disagree on that, but the international community and the political community has agreed on these dimensions of the human being. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for instance, among other treaties, acknowledge the human being as part of a community. I can put you some context on that, but we have to bear in mind, like what we agree as an international community is that the human being and the children throughout the educational process is not just an individual. We have to teach them who he is within a bigger and a broader sense. Well, that was what I was just saying, but anyway. The human being is not, yeah. Sorry about that, I just skip these two because I just say them. So yeah, so here what is important is that this part of the human being as a social being, an individual being, when we think about education, it's already, many declarations talk about that. For instance, the most recent document that refers on education, the most recent UNESCO declaration says, all persons are entitled to quality education and training that fully respect their cultural identity. Also, the special reporter on the right to education of the United Nations, on the most recent report she acknowledged the importance of the cultural dimension of the human beings, and she said, children have to know who they are, where are they coming from, they have to know the culture they have around them. They have to freely follow a process of identification with the closer community. This process is what is going to enable them to know who they are and later to go out and participate in intercultural dialogue in equality of opportunities. Like we cannot participate in an intercultural dialogue if we don't know who we are. Also, we cannot critically think who we are if we don't know, like we cannot critique, for instance, our religion or our community if we don't know the rules of our religion or our community or our, I don't know, ideological or the philosophical ideas of our communities. Neither we can contribute to them. Like we cannot contribute to our closer community if we don't know the rules of our community. And more important, education is not just about how. We don't have to answer only the question of how. How do we do things? How to become a good lawyer, but also has to answer the questions of whys. And here I put this speech of Clemenceau, which was a president of the French Republic, who say, in teaching, the teacher needs to say something. It is necessary for him to take sides. It is necessary to him to say whether he approves or blames. When you come to the story of Tiberius and when you have to explain the drama of Judea, what opinion will you have? We can think about that about this, but we also can think about Jesus or Mahoma or Lenin. Like at some point, you have to give concrete answers to students, and it is hard to do that without a neutral education, unless we want only to prepare like good workers. But education is not about just preparing good workers; it's about preparing good human beings and good future citizens. And that, in an homogeneous, we are no longer living in a homogeneous society. Like we are living in a plural world with different conceptions of good life. I'm sure like if I'm going among you and I'm asking you what do you believe or which kind of education you want for your children, there would be a plurality of answers. And probably even there is going to be a plurality of, we all have the same questions, but then the way we answer these questions is different, especially on essential issues. So in a pluralistic society, and in an increasing pluralistic society, it's impossible to have consensual answer for all that. Therefore, we need different educational answers for that in order the children know who they are and how do they identify themselves in culturally speaking. Just to finish and to give you some things to say, the cornerstones of educational pluralism. Once we bear in mind that we want to actually fulfill this aim of education to teach the children who they are, and we know like we need a plurality of different schools, what should be the cornerstones of educational pluralism? First, we should put parents in the center of the design of educational policies. Most of problems that children have are the same problems that families have. The children that are part of a minority, they are not part of a minority by themselves. They are part of a minority because their family is part of a minority. The children that have social problems, they are not having social problems only, them. They have social problems because they are part of a family with social problems. And then parents here, it's not like we are giving the right of parents, like say, like you are the owner of your children, do whatever you want. It's like the Convention of the Rights of the Child says the parents are the responsible of the upbringing of the children. And one of the dimensions for the best interest of the child is the cultural dimension. So they are probably the ones as responsible that know more what is better for the cultural dimension of their children. Therefore, what we cannot do is put them aside. We have to put them in the middle in the moment of designing and choosing the education that is better for their children. Second thing is the important role of non-governmental schools. We cannot have a pluralistic education without governmental schools. We can put the parents in the middle, but if they are the only ones in the middle and they don't have anything to choose, what are they going to choose among, you know? So we need non-governmental schools to exist. The third thing is the importance of relations of trust between parents, civil society, and non-governmental schools. And this framework of trust, it's not just, oh yeah, you exist and we have to hear you. We need clear frameworks based on human rights and based on rules on democracy, under which conditions these people can exist, and under which conditions even these people can access to public funding. Now, in a recent declaration, in a recent resolution of the European Parliament, it says the importance of increasing inclusiveness and ensuring freedom of educational choice. Sorry, I'm going to go again. In a recent resolution of the European Parliament, it pointed that the provision of adequate financial support for schools of all categories and levels, both state schools and non-for-profit private schools, was essential for inclusiveness. Otherwise, the only ones who can choose the education they want for their children are either the ones who are happy with public education or either the ones who have enough income to choose an education that is not the one that is run by the state. And finally, it is important to have a non-comprehensive and consensual civic education. And this is also an important part. Even though we have a pluralistic world and even though we have a different of pluralistic educational schools, we need a consensual, non-comprehensive and consensual civic education, because at the end these people are going to be part of the same national project, they are going to be part of the European project, but what we need is this education to be something that all the actors have participated. Maybe there are points that we don't need to touch, but what we need is to teach these children that even though they need to know who they are and to where are they going, also that they bear in mind, like we have some rules that we share. Maybe the human rights can be the cornerstone of that. And also, if we don't do that, one of the problems of not doing that, not having this sort of consensual civic education that is based in which all the actors can participate, is that some communities can fall apart, and this is also a good ground for radicalization. Like imagine they say, yeah, human rights is against your religion, or democratic rules are against, or you're going to a civic education and they diminish what you believe. It's more essential in your life. Basically, what you're going to say is like, I don't want to be part of this society. So we need a civic education that, even though it's not as comprehensive as some people want, everybody can feel a part of, and they feel that their national projects and their European projects, it's part of that they belong also. And that would be it. I'm going to give the floor to Rodrigo to go on with that. I think you want to use this one?
I can use that.
Yeah?
It's easy. Okay, let's see. It's not easy to speak sitting down, but standing up, I'll be behind the table. I think it's even worse. And if I go there, the guy who's trying to film this won't catch me, so let's try to do this in a reasonable way. Okay, and I would like to start by highlighting 3 ideas that come from what Ignasi said, and now I will try to give you a more hands-on approach as we divided this talk. And so the three ideas that two ideas I would like to keep from Ignasi. One, there is no such thing as a neutral education. When you educate, by definition, you end up taking sides. It could be math, it could be science, biology, chemistry, language, literature. You are always taking sides, even if just the way you speak, the way you behave, because, and we are thinking about K-12 education, even what you are or what you seem to be is educating your students. Second thing, a child, a human being, needs to build his or her identity before he or she can rebel against the given identity by their community and then make some different choices or rewrite the cultural identity of that community. So it's not as if we were all just a blank piece of paper where somebody is going to write the story. With these two ideas in mind, I would try to convince you, share with you some stories why education pluralism is very important, not only for each one of our countries, but also for the European project. And I would like to begin with two quick aspirational stories. One is about M from the Czech Republic. M trained as an English teacher because he thought, maybe if I learn English, that may give me access to something different. M grew up in occupied Czech Republic. Okay? Then he grew up and he was forced to go to the Soviet army to serve for a while. And then when he got out of the army, because the state said that was time enough in the army, he was told to go to a certain city and to teach in a certain school. And then the Berlin Wall came down. And M, with two more friends, said, we are going to make a school. We have to teach children that they are not property of the state. They can take care of their lives. They do not have to grow up to obey. Second story is about O. O was in her house when the invading army came and killed her family. And she was taken by the state to be educated by the state. O is a lady that never smiles. And she says, it was my upbringing that gave me this face. I'm sorry. I know that was decades ago, but I am just not able. And so, when her country was freed, O put an independent school because she said, this can happen never again. And I am not sure if my country is going to be free forever. And so we have to educate children so that they want to be free and they learn how to be free. Well, and of course, these are very radical stories. In Europe, these are not stories from the 18th century. These are living people. But of course, for most of us, these are radical stories. And we have, most of us, been brought up in a place where this tension between education and the state looks more like we're here to help. And so, a lot of the debate about pluralism and education, a lot of debate, should parents choose? Should the state choose? Should public school, what does this mean? What does public education mean? Should there be more of independent or less independent schools? We usually have this discussion within a moderate political framework. But we have to always remember, moderate political frameworks cannot be taken for granted. So we have to have the structural instruments to make sure that as time goes by, we continue living in moderate political frameworks. And this is where independent education comes in. And here I will be referring to independent education as any kind of formal education, so it's a school, and it's a school run by any type of civil society organism. It could be a person, a company, a not-for-profit. Well, the only rule is it's a school that is not run by a state or a region, okay, not by a public authority. We are 20 million students in independent education in Europe today. So this makes around 18% of the students in K-12 in Europe. So it's a minority, but it's a very big minority. What I think is interesting when we speak about independent education in Europe is the enormous difference between countries. So in this graph, what you are seeing is the country, of course, then the percentage of students in public education, public meaning state or regional run or municipality, but a public entity running the school. Then private education, state dependent, so it's a private school or independent school as you wish, but it's funded by the state, so the parents do not have to pay the school. The third column is private independent in the sense that the parents have to pay to have their kids in that school. And the last column is total percentage of students in that country in private or independent education. And what's interesting is you can see we have a lot of countries from 70% in the Netherlands, 60, 20% around 20, 30% in Spain. And we have a lot of countries where the percentage of students going to independent schools is very small. Then you have a lot of interesting places where you have big majority of students in independent education being funded by the state, and you have places where only a small majority of, or a small number of students is funded by the state. I showed this graph that the numbers are a little bit old, it's from 2016, but still, just that sometimes when we are debating about education, independent education, the place of the state in education, this debate is very culturally biased. Depending on which country you come from, then you understand completely different things when we speak about freedom of education, school choice, and so on. And again, going back to something Ignasi said, this is a big discussion in the United States, but it's funny because in the United States, the issue is there was not a problem of freedom of education because in fact, schools were governed by the majority, Protestants. And the school choice wars began when Catholics said, well, we want our schools. We want our kids educated in our faith. Why? Because in American public schools, not state-run, but district-run schools, you would pray in the morning, you would go to Mass, but it was the Protestant view. And so Catholics are saying, no, we have a different view, we want. And so, of course, the school choice wars are about religion, are about worldviews, are about values. That's the whole fundamental of education. And this is why when the state comes in a lot of countries, the public approach to education, it's just a third religion. It's not the Protestants against the Catholics or vice versa. It's laïcité. It's about the no religion against the religion. So at the end of the day, the discussion is never neutral, and there is a big majority of people within this discussion. And I will leave you the PowerPoint. This is just get the glimpse. It's so different around Europe. What's an important point? And when we look at aggregate numbers, only 50%, it depends, only 50%, because I am aiming for more, but already 50% if you are aiming for less, but around half of students in Europe going to independent schools have some sort of state support to be in that school. The problem of funding is a problem of equity. And so, even though the biggest argument against the growth of independent schools in Europe on the political arena usually is public education in the sense of state-run education is more inclusive. It's what guarantees that everybody comes together. Private education is an elitistic thing. Well, that argument simply is not true. The evidence shows that in countries where there is more funding for students to be in independent schools, there is more diversity within the schools. I would say this is a bread and butter issue. come on, if you have to pay to go to that school, then only rich people will go to that school. If you give everybody money to choose school, then people will probably be more together. And that's what the evidence shows us. In countries with more support for choice for parents, you have more diversity within the schools. In countries with small support for parents, you have less diversity within schools. And sorry, just 30 minutes anecdote, just because I was listening to Barbara on the previous, and she was speaking about the new Greek government and what they were doing in the pensions and labor laws and so on. And yes, that of course, in education, it's very interesting because during the lockdown, the Greek government, in Greece, private schools have no support whatsoever, and they're a very small minority. But during the lockdown, the government put up an LMS, learning management system, for public schools. And so they were very happy because the next day or the next week, everything would be okay, kids at home, and it's all online. Well, the first day they tried on the system, it went kaloops, it didn't work, it was horrible, and they had to make a quick decision, and they said, so kids from first grade to 7th or 8th, I don't recall, not a problem, are going to be on the learning management system in the morning, and the older kids are going to be in the afternoon. And you in the private schools, you do not get to use this platform, but still, you can only teach the young children in the morning, and you cannot teach the older children in the morning, because that would be an unfair advantage for the private school kids. The same happened in my country, in Portugal. At a moment in time, the government said on the second lockdown, oh no, well, let's do a vacation. 2 weeks of vacation for schools, and then in the summer we'll go for 2 weeks more. And the private sector, we said, well, okay, we might even consider going 2 weeks more in the summer, but we will go on teaching and learning because we're not going to stop now. And the government said, no. And they passed a law saying it's forbidden for private schools to have any contact with students in the next 2 weeks because it's a vacation. That would be an unfair advantage for private school kids. And so, just a quick anecdote, but these things really do get really political, because of course this has nothing to do with education or anything else. Okay, and so again, just to continue on the idea that there is a lot of diversity within the funding mechanisms of independent education, not only in Europe, but also in the OECD. And something I like to bring to the front, especially when we are speaking, and I know most of you are from Spain, though not all of you, but the countries that have more, I wouldn't say sympathy, but where funding for independent schools is 100%, that it's not an issue, are the Northern Light countries. So Denmark, Finland, even unsuspicious Finland, 100% payment for independent schools, even though they are in a small number. The Netherlands, it's the biggest place for school choice. And then we have a lot of countries where school choice really doesn't even exist in these terms of for the poor to also be able to choose. Greece, Mexico, Portugal, the United States, because even though it's a big thing, and well, if we have one day something about funding, they have tax vouchers, tax credits, charter schools, vouchers. They have a lot of different instruments, but still it's under 1% of the school population that benefit from these mechanisms. Okay, and now just funding is also still a very difficult issue when we speak about education, because the idea is rules follow the money. So if you get public money, you probably will get more red tape, or at least this is the baseline of the discussion. And so we have some interesting debates in Denmark, for instance, where independent schools only receive 75%. The former government was bargaining, was trying to give more money to the schools, and it was the independent school sector says, no. 75% is more than enough. It's only a small amount, and we want parents engaged in the school. And if people take things for completely free, more often than not, they may not be so engaged. So we want to be able to have some money from the parents so that we are sure they really want they really want to come here. In Sweden, a big debate that now seems to have gone under the table, but a big debate on 100% funding for independent education, but a big problem with religious schools. And in the Swedish society came more the thing about, well, Islamic schools and Islamic fear, but then it's so all religious schools should be banned from receiving any funding from the state, and this went back and forth, though then it stopped, but still it was a problem. In Spain, well, and you know the story better than me, but it's been an issue for the last years. In Portugal, we have 5 different systems of funding independent schools, but all of them have been cut to around 10% by this government, and so things are not going well. The US is worth looking for when we think about funding of independent education, because in the US they have such a big diversity, and so things change a lot very quickly. I would like to underline, and that's why also I speak about the US, when we speak about school choice, pluralism in education, there is another factor that, well, Ignasi and I come from the same perspective, but it's a different perspective from other people who are defending school choice. You can look at this from the efficiency, and then going back to what Barbara was saying about the administrative and well, you can look at this from the efficiency side, and so economic rationale approach, a market approach to education would say, well, if the customer is free to choose, prices will come down, quality will be rewarded, and so kids will learn better in all schools if we have freedom of choice, if we have a universal voucher system. And then you have another approach, the one we really prefer, it's the value approach. It's not about efficiency. At the end of the day, I'm not really worried if kids get 1 or more or 2 or 3 points extra on international or national examinations. It's about freedom. It's a structural thing. I can choose to get my kids into this school that's non-religious or whatever because I like its values, even though they don't prepare kids so well for the exam. Okay? So our approach is a value-based, it's a philosophical approach. It's a subsidiarity. Civil society can educate children. There is no need for the state to intervene. Some national concerns that we have had. Well, Greece, with the present government, things have been overturned, but with the previous government, and so again, this is very political. It's more political than pedagogical. To strike down on independent education, the former government tried to put VAT in education, and again, we had to, well, try to lobby as much as we could at the European Union because, in fact, this was against the VAT directive, and so we had some chance, and they ended up not changing the Greek VAT code to put VAT in education. Then they turned to the labor law, and so the new law that was in force until this government got rid of it was that in a private sector school, independent school, no money from the state, but still if you wanted to fire a teacher, you would have to have a committee with 1 person representing the employer, 1 person representing from the union side, and 1 person from the ministry, and it would be this troika that would decide if you could or could not fire that teacher. In Spain, the limitation of the concertados. At the European level, our biggest concern is always an anti-independent school ideology that really comes mainly from MEPs from Southern Europe, where this issue is more tense in political terms. And we have a lot of difficulty convincing people from the north of Europe, look, this is important to battle for. Well, the Dutch MEPs say, well, that's not even an issue. It's in our constitution. It's been there from early 20th century when we solved the problem between the state and the church. The problem was solved, well, give education to the church and give all the rest to the state. Well, and now it's not a church thing, but independent education is something that they don't even question, and the 80% of students go some form of independent schools. There is a growth in Southern Europe, again, of hardline left-wing parties that take this as a real fight. So one way of uniting different fractions, well, most of you surely have seen The Life of Brian, Monty Python, and so we're in the Colosseum, and we are arguing who is more Marxist than the other, and one way of getting rid of those arguments is fighting against a common foe. Independent education is usually a very convenient common foe to fight against. And I end putting on your historical knowledge. Who wrote this? And I am very sorry, you are all so much younger than me. I hope you know the author, because even his friends now say he shouldn't be read. Gramsci. Because when you think of it, for Marxists, for liberals, for conservatives, for religious people, for whomever, we should be educating our own and letting our own rebel against our ideas, and in the long run, probably children who mature into adults will make good decisions on their own, but we need to give them a baseline, a value-based, a cultural perspective of life, even if it's for them to rebel against it. Thank you very much.
Okay, are there any questions?
Thank you both very much for your presentation. So I have at least a couple of questions, but I'll try to be brief. So, Ignasi, when you talked about this conception of freedom as autonomy, so it came to my mind that there are at least two ways in which within the educational system, children can be set apart from their parents. One being the state not allowing, the parents to decide what sort of education they want for the children. But a different one, in which perhaps you could elaborate a bit, would be to treat children as adults, as tiny adults, right? Which is an appealing conception. But that would also break families apart, right? So, the state or the international institutions would be, or the Convention on the Rights of the Children from the UN would be treating children as tiny adults. With all the implications that has for parents. And then my other comment would be so when we try to think about what our ideological adversaries have in mind, is it something ideological itself? Because as you just said, Rodrigo, so even socialists should agree with the idea of freedom of education. So is it about ideology, or is it simply because I think it's obvious that it's easier to govern homogeneous societies and not, divided societies? And we cannot deport people anymore, at least. I'm not saying that's desirable. But governments, even within liberal democracies, or perhaps especially within liberal democracies, governments try to homogenize to some extent, partly through media outlets, information, and partly through education. So we cannot homogenize racially, we cannot homogenize religiously, but we can definitely do so through education. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna try to give some. Are you hearing me right? Yeah. Yeah. So about the idea of autonomy, about this idea of treating children as adults. I think one of the problems is that when people read the Convention on the Rights of the Child, many times there is an interested reading of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And if there is a Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's because the child is meant to be, and they are being able to exercise their rights as far as they are growing. That's why there are certain rights, like, for instance, you cannot get married when you are 4, but in certain occasions you can get married when you are 16 if you prove like certain situations. The same for opening a business. You cannot open a business when you are 4, but when you are 16, under certain circumstances you can. And here, the relation between, sometimes I think many people are trying to present the relation between parents and children in a way that it's ridiculous, right? If you remember, the Minister of Spain said, parents are not the owners of children. Well, no one advocates for that. No one advocates for that. Even if you think like even the Catholic Church, you know, that someone could say like, oh, this is an institution with a really comprehensive way of living. It considers that the relation between children and parents are fiduciary. Like parents have to take care of their children, but to make sure that their rights are accomplished and that once they are adults, they are having a fulfilling life. And then the best parents are, and at the end, the way the convention understands the relation between parents and children is that it's a relation of responsibility. They are not saying, well, the state also has certain role of responsibility, but they say the parents are the first responsibles of the bringing of the children. They know what is best for them and what is worse for them. Of course, there is a certain right that they have to respect and they are not the owners, so they cannot say, you know, I have 8 children, so I have a factory and I force them to work. You know, there are certain rights that they have to respect, but at the end, like on essential questions such as the upbringing, and this is explicitly say there, the convention considers, well, as children have different needs, and children are different according to their circumstances, we trust parents to take decisions on their behalf as far as they are growing. Of course, like, and once again, if we're thinking about a child who is 17 and who definitely doesn't want to go to school, and their parents are forcing them to go to school, he has ways to go out. But this is this relation. As far as children are growing, parents are less responsible of them because they are capable of exercising their rights. Here, I think, like many times, people are trying to present a dystopic scenario of it's one or the other. Well, I think this is just more complex than that. And child, it's developing. As far as child is growing, the relation within parents and children is changing. And also, parents don't have this. This is not an ownership relationship. It's a fiduciary or responsible relationship. Here, I think also what is important to say is on what you were saying, like this idea of homogenization. Well, when we think about the origin of public education, it really changed from one country to another. Some people even say like the first public system was organized by San Jose de Calasanz in Rome for poor children. But if we think about the state-run public education, well, many authors, they talk about this idea, like, well, for instance, in Napoleon, when he established public education in France, one of his motivations was like, we need to prepare future citizens of the Republic, so we need to make sure that at least they receive certain knowledge. Or the same for in Germany with Bismarck, no, with the Kulturkampf, like he needed to prepare children for the future of this great Germany he has in mind. I think here there is an important thing to say. As you have realized, Rodrigo and I try to avoid as much as possible private and public education. And we try to say governmental and non-governmental schools or independent schools, because we consider that like non-governmental schools are playing a public service. And I think it's a category that we have to overcome. Like, for when we understand public, what we understand is like they have a public service. And at the end, like independent schools are preparing citizens that are going to play a public role in life. They are preparing public servants, they are preparing politicians, they are preparing businessmen, and they all have an they are going to have an important role for our societies. So here what I'm saying is like when we have to, I mean, even though there is this motivation, what we have to overcome is the idea like public education doesn't have to be the education right by the state. Public education is all education because even independent schools don't have the right to do whatever they want. Like we cannot say, you know what, and no one is advocating for that. We are not saying like, if you want to run a school, you know, and teach, I don't know, fascist ideas, you don't have the right to do so. Why? Because education is a public service and we are preparing children for the future. What we are saying is like, in order to prepare children for the future, we need something more than just schools run by the government. Sorry.
Just to chip in on that, I'll go over the first question because treating children as tiny adults, I think we still have a long way to go. It's not clear what children are, I think. So just for fun of it, in 18-something, the first known trial, so judicial thing about adults beating up a child was in New York, Sue Ellen Wilson, I think, in 18-something, that she was in foster care and the foster parents beat her up and a neighbor was this was very unpleasant, this couldn't be, and she went to the police and the police said, well, we can't do anything, it's the child of their legal child, they're the legal guardians, they can do whatever, because back then the child was ownership of the legal guardians. But she didn't quit. She wanted to protect the child, and so she went to Animal Protection Society in New York, and they filed suit against the foster parents, saying there is a law in New York City saying you cannot beat animals. Well, Sue Ellen is of the animal kingdom, so you cannot beat Sue Ellen. And it's, you know, and from then we've evolved. It's not this, but I think we still have, and your question is right to the mark, what is the child and who has the right to say things. I would say at the end of the day, biology is very, very strong. And so, well, but the second one is, I'm more interested because it's this systemic thing. Is it easier to run? It's the political issue. Is it easier to run an homogeneous nation? And so let's take public education in the sense of state-run education, so I, in power, can determine what children will think in the future. I think that sometimes in the history of different countries that was the case, clearly the case. Nowadays, I think it's completely off, it's different. What I see in the arguments in the different countries we visit, help independent schools, it's all about elections, it's all about public service, it's all about hiring teachers, you know? So in most of these countries, and I would bet, I don't know the details about the Spanish situation, but I would bet that if you get rid of concertados, you will hire more teachers as public servants, and so you as governor of the region will have more people depending on you. It's also a union thing. Public school teachers typically pay union dues. Independent school teachers typically don't pay union dues. Well, the union depends on having members. And so the biggest number of public school teachers, the more powerful I am, the smallest number. And so I think it's completely off. It's not about the child. It's not about values. It's about teachers and non-teaching staff and unions and political hustles and getting the votes. I would argue that's the main driver in Europe nowadays in the countries that are having these problems. Another driver, also true in the northern countries mostly, is migration. So very generous school choice instruments in place, and society getting really uncomfortable, with or without reason, that's not the debate I'm having, but getting uncomfortable, what are they teaching those kids in those schools? And so, again, it's religious, it's cultural, and it's another driver in other countries.
Okay.
Thank you, Ignasi and Rodrigo. So I have a question that is, what could be a way to encourage civil society in order to found or create independent schools? Because what I see normally, well, in Spain it is obvious, is that it's the Catholic Church or things related to a religion. It's okay, but maybe people who think, I don't know, Mesori, for instance, or other people with other values, and I think that would be great that they can create their own schools, and therefore it's more plural and more, it's like a mosaic. It's not like, and I think it's better for everyone, and I don't know how to encourage or how to, or what would be your proposal or idea.
Well, I'm not a school promoter, and I haven't opened a school, but I met different people that have opened schools in the last years. Like actually, one of the former employees of OIDEL now is trying to open a school in Geneva, and it's, what I can say, all the people I met who are trying to open a school, it's one of the most exciting projects. And here I think one problem, or well, one idea behind educational pluralism or freedom of education is that behind the idea of educational pluralism, that was an idea. I became the director of OIDEL 3 years ago, and previously there was this man who passed away, that's why I became a director, whose name was Alfred, and he always say, freedom of education at the end is the right of choosing your own teacher, no, which is something that makes sense. And I see, like, whenever I see someone who has the motivation for opening a school, which is a nightmare. It's a beautiful project, and it's lovely to see, and when it's so beautiful to see, which with the passion that people that have created their own school, they explain to that, a lot of suffering, but it's beautiful to see. There is always the need of saying something that cannot, the need of them giving the chance to certain children to hear something that they cannot learn elsewhere. For instance, we can see that with international schools, like many people want to open international schools because they want their children to have a better opportunity, or to embrace a culture that they think it could be better for them in the future, or that they don't lose their roots. The same can happen with faith-based schools. They feel like, I feel like certain of my values are being ridiculized in the government-run system, so therefore I want schools where my children can value what they consider is the most beautiful thing they have, which is their faith or certain cultural values. And I think one of the problems with that is that many times, one of the problems, I mean, the big motivation for opening a school is having something to say, having something to bring to society. And I think and that was the motivation in all the countries when there has been a growing of schools. Like, for instance, in France, when there has been the explosion of Catholic schools, it was after the revolution. All the schools became like quite ideological oriented, so there was all these communities who started opening schools. The same we can say in some parts of Europe, that Catholic became the big religion, and some Protestant schools decide like we are gonna open the schools. But in Spain, for instance, when the society was quite Catholic homogeneous, where the free thinkers who say like we want schools where we can teach our children in our particular point of view, la escuela libre and all these currents. I think that the thing that we need is there is an anthropological problem behind, like, the moment we put truth under question, and at the moment, like, well, we can question, there is no things to say because everything is a relation of power. There is less motivation for people for creating your own school, because what is the point if there is no thing to say?
Well, in a nutshell, I've seen people all over Europe putting up schools for, I would say, 3 main reasons. One, and it's not in, it's just any order. One, money. You can make a lot of money out of school. It's a sector as any other sector. You have in Brazil and in the US, you have public listed companies that are, and you have hedge funds, and you have risk capital, you have invest. It's also in Europe, it's not on the stock market yet, but so making money out of it. and making money out of it in two very different strands that are curious. One, posh schools, so elite, high stand, very expensive schools. Another that's growing and growing and has had a lot of problems with the ideology, but it's growing even more in Africa. Low-cost schools, just having something that every child could go to. Okay, they're making money out of it. Yes, they're making money out of it. It's the only way those kids are going to school. So, and it have to be low cost because the families can't pay. So, making money. Second, values. So, churches, religions in general open schools because they want to educate the youngs. It's easy to say. Values like freedom, the examples I gave you in the beginning. So, people who say this never again. We have to educate in a different way. The IBO was put up to make sure, or that was the original idea, not for profit, to make sure that Europe would live in peace for the coming forever. Steiner schools with the same idea, we have value-based, you want to make peace. And the third one that I find very interesting, and it's all over the places also, it's families with a lot of kids who look around and say, I don't like anything I see. And say they put up a school, and they're called mom and pop schools. Little schools, and some of them then became very big schools, but I don't like what I see, I want something better for my kids, and so I make a school. So it can be a lot of diversity. Well, and this is just an anecdote. I only know this in Portugal, but I bet they're all over the world also. We even have two independent schools that were founded by unions who fight independent schools in the political arena, but founded schools so their members could have special schools that were better than the alternative. One of them is even a teachers' union.
Well, so thank you very much, Ignasi and Rodrigo.